Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. We'll be beginning in about a minute. I want to let you know, first of all, to feel free to type any questions in the question box or the chat box. I would like to let you know that our speaker today is Dr. Hulett. He is the National Director of Special Ed Services. So again, feel free to type any questions in the chat box, in the question box, and we will begin momentarily.
Okay, well, I guess we're ready to get going here, gang. Are we good, Lily?
We're ready to go.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get ourselves going here. First of all, that was Lily Rivas, one of our customer success specialists, and then we also have Miss Christine Bucko, who is our educational consultant up there in the Northeast and New York in particular, and New Jersey. So it's really quite an honor to have all of you here today. Let's jump right into it. I've been doing this a long time, inclusion in particular, and I started out as an inclusion teacher back in the 90s, right around the advent of the internet. So it has been a minute since I've been doing this and been engaged with inclusion. But let's first answer the question, what is inclusion in collaborative teaching? Because inclusion, mainstreaming, co-teaching, collaborative teaching, it can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different parts of the country. So for purposes of today, when I mention co-teaching or inclusion, what I'm referencing is two licensed teachers, one being regular education, the other one being special education, in a room with majority regular education students. So at least 51% of the students in that class do not have an IEP, and the minority of students do have an IEP. So just to give a little frame of reference, that's what I'm going to be speaking from today. And it's a little different from, say, where we have an aide in the room. And that is a type of co-teaching, but it's different and the expectations are different of that of a licensed professional special educator. Their role is going to be different than that of an aide. So let's also answer another important question. You know, what is great instruction? Because a part of what I'll be talking about today is unique to inclusion, but there are also some aspects that are just very basic and foundational to great instruction. So one is being enthusiastic, excited about what we're teaching. We've talked a lot about differentiation over the years. A truly great inclusion classroom is going to be differentiated because you may have kids who have very low cognition. You could have kids with significant learning abilities, and you could have kids who are gifted and talented. I remember when I was a high school teacher, I had gifted and talented children in my science classes, and I also had children who had IQs of 60. And I had to find a way to challenge kids at both ends of that continuum and keep them focused and interested. And that's where the differentiation comes in. Curtailed to the audience, you know, again, specific to the needs of the kiddos and where they are, targeted, dynamic. And what do I mean by dynamic? Well, when we're talking about dynamic, we mean it's not just a preach and teach, stand and deliver. It is an ebbing and flowing and exciting environment where the content is changing and how we present it is changing. Enjoyable, again, make it fun. Information on demand. Can the kids get information rapidly from the teachers? Can they go online? Can they safe search? These are all important questions. It's critical to have an extensive depth of knowledge. One of the areas we often spread special ed teachers too thin is we put them in a bunch of different inclusion settings, whereas what we really should be doing is trying to get them concentrated in a content that is already a strength of theirs. So when I started out, I did all science. I did all science all day long at the high school level, and it really allowed me to gain a real depth of knowledge with regard to the content and the curriculum, and it helped me feel more confident as a teacher. Immediate feedback, you need formative assessment in the system somewhere that you get immediate feedback as to how the kids are learning to help direct your instruction. And of course, that means data-driven, and then having a time for reflection, and that's having a time for reflection with the inclusion teacher and the regular ed teacher. So let's talk about a few tips for planning and teaching. This is one of our weakest areas. Nationally speaking, I see a lot of different models all over the country. And what I often see are two teachers that have to collaborate together as teachers, but yet they don't even have the same planning period. This is just a core basic tenet of what we need to have. If teachers are going to be held accountable for teaching and planning together, we have to give them time to plan together and to provide really high-level instruction. So build in that planning period that is a consistent time. Now, if you don't have it, then it's incumbent on the regular ed teacher and the special ed teacher to do it before school or after school, on weekends, and none of these are popular. But at the end of the day, we have a moral obligation to our children as special educators to do what we have to make sure we're providing the highest level instruction. So again, admins need to really help their teachers by getting them those same planning periods when and wherever possible. And we talk about doing it at least once a week. Best case scenario is having that planning period every day the same and giving them 5 days a week the opportunity to do so. So let's talk for a minute about a variety of teaching methods. It can take a lot of different forms in the classroom when you have a solid co-teaching approach. So the first one is interactive teaching, and that's where teachers alternate roles of presenting, reviewing, and monitoring instruction. So you start the day with a door opener or bell ringer, and one teacher leads that. They work on it for 5-7 minutes, they're getting engaged. Then the next teacher may come up and say, all right, gang, now we're gonna get into small groups, get into your small groups with your teams. And then that teacher takes that lead. Then maybe you go to station teaching where each of you takes a role. But the idea is that you're alternating roles as the lead in the classroom. And notice I said alternating roles as leads. Yes, the special educator has a role in taking a lead role in that delivery of instruction. And let me tell you, if they never take the lead role, children will not respect them or see them as a full teacher in that classroom. They will see them as an aide if they don't take any direct teach roles. Parallel teaching. Students are divided into mixed ability groups, and each co-teaching partner teaches the same material to one of the groups. So again, we're separating out the groups. You don't always have to have the special ed teacher going with the special ed group or the lower group. You can rotate how that's done, and that can have a lot of benefit on both respects. Alternative teaching. One person teaches, reteaches, or enriches a concept for a small group while the other monitors or teaches the remaining students. This is also really good when you might have some behavioral issues, because sometimes with small group work, kids can get off task, they can be a little difficult. We've all had our moments with that, and having an extra body in there to also monitor, use proxemics, getting close to the kids and addressing behavior so the other teacher can teach unfettered, can be really powerful. Station teaching, this is my personal favorite, and this is where we have small groups of students and they rotate to various stations of instruction, review, and or practice. And what I like on this one is to have each teacher takes a station, so you have 2 teacher directed stations delivering content in 2 different ways, and then you have 3 student directed stations where the expectations are laid out prior to the activity, but the kids have some independence and some ability to direct their own learning. And that's a really nice model we're going to talk more about here in a few minutes. What are some strategies? Some of you folks who've been around a while may recall universal design for learning. UDL is a really good approach. It has not gone away because it's solid, and the basic premise, and we'll talk again more in detail about this very shortly, but the basic premise of UDL is that you're planning for all children, not just the middle group, not just the top group or the bottom group, but for all kids, and you're taking into account all of their learning needs. You're setting learning goals, your instructional goals, your methods, your materials, your assessments, all are taking into account the various approaches. Now, this can take some time to plan, but there really is a lot of benefit to it. Cooperative learning and peer tutoring. This is one of my favorites. I learned this a long time ago. when you have to teach something, you learn it to a higher level than when you're working just to retain the information. So having students tutor other students, the research is there, it's very powerful. And especially if you have a really strong continuum of ability in a classroom where you have gifted and talented, and then you may even have a couple cognitively delayed, that can be a really wonderful opportunity for those kids to work with each other. And it can be so powerful. I've seen it in person and absolutely love that approach. Tiered lessons teach the same concepts with multiple levels of complexity. So let's say I'm teaching history and we're teaching about Jamestown, and I can teach at the most basic level about Captain Smith and Pocahontas and the basics of Jamestown and England and America and colonization, but I can also go into economic modalities, the politics of the times, the triangle trade, commerce. You can really vary the level of questioning to the level of that kiddo. You can vary the group dynamics. And so it's really, tiered lessons is about adjusting it based on the kiddo's needs. The hardest area to probably do this in is mathematics, because you have to really separate out the content that the kids are able to do, but it's a lot easier, I would say, in all the other content areas. But it can certainly be done in math. It's just more of a challenge. Intentional teaching of learning strategies. So this is so critical for our kids, our special education kids, because a lot of times they just don't have the basic skills that a lot of kids pick up over time. So whether it's teaching Cornell notes, note cards, memorization, mnemonic devices, and I'll give you an example of a keyword mnemonic. I remember to this day, I was having kids come up with their own keyword mnemonics to remember SAT vocabulary. And again, this was high school, and the term was octroy. And an octroy is basically a tax collector on the edge of a town. And I remember a kiddo drawing a picture of a little house with an octopus on top of it, and then a big circle around it to indicate it was on the edge of town. And I'll never forget that word because of the way the kid drew it. And it was absolutely brilliant. But there's so many strategies we can give our kiddos to learn and be better learners. So this is a really powerful area. And then we also have awareness of annual goals. I find that quite often, even in inclusion classes, the regular ed teacher is not aware of what the annual goals are for the kids. So if they have a reading goal or a math goal or a writing goal, make sure both teachers know. Now, the special ed teacher, I would say, needs to take the lead on this, and because they're going to need to be able to mark progress for each of these kids. They need to know the nitty-gritty of every goal. But I would make sure that the regular ed teacher has general awareness of what these goals are and where they are. Tips for structured lessons. Again, flexible grouping is my favorite and I think the most powerful. The real challenge is, how do you group the kiddos? What data do you use to group the kids? Are we doing it based on perception, or are we doing it based on data? And the answer is, if you can, base it on data. Another one for structured lessons is looking at universal design. So let's take a second and talk a little bit about universal design and the three key aspects. So with universal design, you have multiple means of representing content. So I'll give you an example of myself. I'm highly dysgraphic, meaning my handwriting is deplorable. So I type everything, I handwrite almost nothing. And I'm a auditory learner, so it's really important that I focus and listen to what a teacher is saying or a professor is saying for me to really learn. And what I learned is that taking notes actually really pulls me away from the auditory process and paying attention to that. So I have my own very clear way of learning, and most kids do. So we really need to focus on helping the kids understand how they learn and presenting the material differently. Then we have multiple means of students' expression of content. There are so many different ways we can have kids present material. And looking forward, it's interesting. When I was a high school teacher for a while, I was also a English resource teacher. And I remember we were teaching the epic poem Beowulf, and I asked the kids to do little plays of their favorite sections. And I'll never forget to this day that Beowulf had the strength of 30 men in one hand or one arm, because the kiddo with big marker wrote on his arm 30 and then acted it out. Well, I may have forgotten that since it was 20 plus years ago, but I certainly remember it now because of the visual the kid put on, and did an incredible job, and they had an absolute ball doing it. But again, so we're looking at multiple means of student expression, and then we're looking at flexible means of engagement as students learn. And going back to the kids doing the skits and the role play, make it fun, make it engaging, get the kids up and moving. A lot of kids who have disabilities also have ADHD. I will tell you from my experience of training adults, you have very little amount of time to grab their attention before they're on their phones or on their laptops doing something else. So kiddos, imagine how hard it is for them going 8 hours a day through this type of academic learning. So we've really got to grab them. UDL is a really nice option, and I recommend you guys look into it more. Small group instruction. All right, so let's talk a little about, since we're talking a lot about it, let's talk a little bit more about specifically what needs to be present to have a really strong environment. So first, the task must be authentic, worthwhile, and appropriate for students working in groups. You need to spend some time really thinking through the group activity, because if the kiddos see it as busy work or paperwork and it's not really authentic, then the kids are going to check out and you're going to end up having behavioral issues. Small group learning must be the goal. Sometimes we start off with the idea of small groups and they just become two different halves of the classroom and we have two very large groups. Keep the groups small, no more than 5. Cooperative behavior should be taught to and used by students. So we often get frustrated when kids act out and don't do so well in groups, but we fail to actually teach the behavior we expect to see. So take a minute, really lay out the expectations, but also teach them how to interact and what it looks like to be a good team player and be in a group and engage and participate. Provide them with the teaching for that. Number 4, group work should be structured so that students depend on one another to complete a task successfully. If you're going to have them work on different components, make sure they're structured in a way that it's critical to the final product that they're presenting, and everybody has a part. And that takes us to the 5th part, which is accountability. Nothing drives teachers crazier than when you have the one kid that's conscientious, so the one kid does the whole project for everybody, so they can, retain a good grade, while the other 4, goof off and don't pay attention. So make sure every kid has an accountability piece and make it as equal as possible. You can assign them tasks, you can have the note taker, you can have the speaker, you can have a number of different tasks that you assign to the kiddos. Graphic organizers, I can't recommend this higher. Kids are so visual, and I think they're becoming more and more visual with social media and all of the graphic images that they're coming across. And when I say graphic images, I mean graphics and all of the images that they're coming across in their daily life. It's got to be thousands more than what we did when we were kids, hundreds of thousands more. So the kids are getting used to a lot of imagery. They're seeing a lot of graphics. Their brains are getting used to seeing a lot of information and having their brain kind of maximized at all times. So we have to keep them interested and engaged, and that's where graphic organizers can really come in, and we can look at word walls, word maps, process maps. You can do the scaffolded close method, fill in this section. There are just so many different ways. Venn diagrams, all of them are really good. Another one I love, and I love to do this with adults as well, is I do, we do, you do. And it's so simple, but it's so powerful, which is simply model the behavior. So let's say you're doing revision and editing, you're teaching the writing process, and you have a real broad variety of kiddos. So you may be teaching the editing process, you model it for all the kids, then you have them get into, you can have small groups or pair them up into 2. And then you're going to have them have their own activity and their own practice with their own accountability. So they get to see the information twice, one by the teacher, 2 in the group, and then by the time it gets to them to kind of fly solo, they've already seen it twice and hopefully have really gotten some practice in. So I do, we do, you do is a really powerful, simple way to scaffold, and something I used to, when I was a principal, I would have all of my new teachers. This was one of the first things we worked with them on strategically. Think, pair, share, another great way, and again, I use this a lot with adult learners. It works really well with kids. You just need to make sure you get your pairs correct. Make sure you don't have 2 knuckleheads paired together, and because they'll now just be knuckleheads together. But think, pair, share. Again, throw out a concept, a question, something that really takes some thinking, have the kids pair up, and then have them share out. It gets them engaged, and I notice with adult learners in particular, they only like to sit for so long without having engagement with other human beings. So give them a chance to engage as much as possible. If you notice it's getting loud or they're getting carried away, shift immediately back to the think part, the individual teacher doing direct delivery. But this is a super powerful one that can also change it up and keep it from becoming monotonous or boring. So combined effort, I wanted to throw this one out at you guys because this is really powerful. And the idea of this is teaching learning strategies within the context of a course. So let's say I really want my kiddos to learn Cornell notes, and that's a goal that most of my kids have, and I'm an inclusion teacher. Well, I could teach it as a separate content strand within a social skills class, but then there's no context. So what I'd recommend is taking a few minutes out of some of these classes, such as social studies, teach Cornell notes within the construct of the actual course. And it really adds a lot of power to the strategy. And here's the deal, all kids, college kids can benefit from learning more organizational strategies and things such as Cornell notes. So take time out of these core content classes, and we know time is tight, but you know, it's going to look a little different in math than it does in science, than it does in social studies, and the kids are going to have to learn some nuances to note taking. So you're also staying within the content. You're not getting out of it if you're just working on how to organize thoughts and how to move forward with some of these strategies. Assessment, this is an area we do need help in nationally, and it's a great opportunity in inclusion environment because we have 2 teachers. So we can be assessing one group of kids in a small group, you know, have them on laptops, have them taking the assessment, and then we rotate through all the kids. And basically you can get all the assessments done through a station model activity. But we really need good data, and in special education in particular, for all your kids on IEPs, legally they have to progress monitor their actual annual goals. So this can be a great way to collect data throughout the class period. And I really recommend standardized assessments so that we're sure they're reliable and valid. Quite often I see teacher-made quizzes and tests, and for special education, for the legal process, I really don't recommend that. And for a minimum reason, teachers leave. And if you can't get the paperwork, then you can't prove you assessed. Whereas with today's assessments, they sit in servers and you have access to them as long as you have that product. So that's another key way to do it. And you can also save it to Excel spreadsheets. There are a lot of options you have. So let's talk a minute about common pitfalls. So the biggest pitfall I see is often a lack of planning, where the inclusion hasn't been structured in a way where the teachers really have quality time to plan and reflect. So that's the first thing. Another, one leads while the other one sits. So I can't tell you how many times as a principal I went into inclusion classrooms and I would see the special education teacher sitting at the back of the room, maybe working on an IEP or doing paperwork or grading papers. This is not the role of an inclusion teacher. The inclusion teacher at a minimum should be up and moving, assisting kids, and also helping to deter behavior management issues. So we need to have a quality of instruction, and the special educator should not become the aide in the back of the room. Running errands and working in IEPs during class. I've seen the special educator become the errand runner, run to the copier, run to the printer, run to the main office, take this kid here. Again, you are a licensed teacher in a classroom, and if you do the duties of an aide, you're going to be perceived, and not that being an aide is bad, but that's not your role. Your role is to be a licensed teacher. Lack of tracking of implementation of modifications and accommodations. This is something that's becoming a greater and greater and higher expectation, is that we track these. This is something that can be very appropriate for an inclusion teacher to do, is to track when we actually use modifications and accommodations in the classroom. Lack of core content provided by special education teachers must be seen as equals, even if it's 5 minutes a day that you're providing direct instruction of core content. A licensed teacher should be able to present K-12 content. Now, when you get into physics and calculus, we don't have a lot of our kids in those classes, but I would say we should expect our special ed teachers to carry some of that water, because again, they won't be perceived as equals. So they also need some training and support to make sure they have their core content. Lack of differentiation. We have such an opportunity to differentiate with 2 folks in the room, and sometimes I will still see stand and deliver. Lack of addressing learning styles and implementing different teaching approaches. You know, so often, and especially as we get higher into secondary schools, we tend to get away from the station work, the small groups, and the multiple modalities of learning, and we move more into this stand and deliver. And our kids don't tolerate that very well. I mean, in particular, our adults don't tolerate that very well because they get off task and get bored. So we really have to engage these kiddos, particularly the ones with learning difficulties to begin with. They're already starting with a challenge. So let's talk about operationalizing the process. So you say, all right, Kurt, so you say diagnostically screen, group students, differentiate instruction and progress monitor. That's a lot. What does it look like? Okay, so let's talk through the 3 different phases of how we would go about that. So if we're going to look at phase 1, this is what you would do before a class that you want to teach. So the first thing we're going to do is diagnostically screen all students and evaluate individual profiles. Now, the reason I say diagnostically screen is we need to know what the challenges are and why the students are struggling. So, for example, you can screen a kid using oral reading fluency and reading. And what that's going to tell you is that the kiddo is struggling to read. Well, the teacher knew that. They need to know why. So what you need to know is, how are they doing in phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary? You know, where are the deficits, so you know what to address. Then what you're going to need to do is group the students based on learning needs, strengths, and deficits. Now, that doesn't mean you put all the deficits all the time together, but you may, if you have 5 kids that are struggling in vocabulary, you may have a vocabulary station, or you may have some remediation you provide, and you provide it specifically to those kids with vocabulary issues. The challenge becomes, how do you do all of this? And we're going to talk about that. So here's an example of a diagnostic screener here, or a diagnostic assessment that you could use to screen your kiddos. And this is an individual report where it's going to show you that this kiddo, high frequency words, word recognition, spelling, and reading comprehension are all areas of considerable deficit. And you'll notice areas such as oral vocabulary and phonics are areas of strength. So you wouldn't want this kiddo in, say, a remediation group for vocabulary, because the kiddo is doing really well. But comprehension, the kiddo really is going to need some extra help in comprehension. So the first thing is determining what are the issues and why are they struggling in reading. The next thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to group your kiddos. Now, I used to use this program when I was a principal. So one of the big challenges we had was grouping kiddos and how to get them in equal groups based on their needs, especially when we were doing intervention groups for RTI. And so what this software does here on the DORA assessment, diagnostic online reading assessment, is that you have the ability to group them based on each of these areas. So if you look at profile A, those kids are all low in decoding, low in vocabulary, low in comprehension. Whereas you get to the purple group at the very end under profile H, they're all medium high across the same areas. So you need some ability to group, even if you do it manually. But with technology today, it's gotten a lot easier to group the kiddos. Then phase 2 is once you know how to group the kids, you know what their deficits are, you know how they learn, and which ones do and don't have learning challenges, you're going to provide direct instruction to the whole group using paired interactive teaching. So you're going to rotate back and forth between your regular teacher and your special ed teacher. The non-teaching partner moves throughout the room, helping students individually. So again, that non-teaching, direct teaching person, the non-person is going to be actively moving and engaged with the kiddos and helping scaffold the learning for those kids. Now, you're going to want to hit a section of that class period where you're going to provide small group activities with 4 to 5 students per group. And you want at least 1 group with technology personalized learning and 2 direct teach, which are small groups, which will be done by the teachers, and then stations led by teachers. So 2 of those, each of those may be your major areas of deficit. So maybe it's vocabulary, and you're going to differentiate it based on the needs of each group. But your group of kiddos that are all struggling in vocabulary, obviously, you're going to hit that really strong. During this time, you're going to engage in standardized formative assessment. And again, there are a lot of different ways to formatively assess, but you need to gain some form of formative assessment during those group activities. And then you're going to evaluate data and identify areas of growth. Now, you can do it during class, but quite often you want to reflect after class and take a look and see how you're doing. Here's an example of personalized learning through Let's Go Learn, and I just wanted you to see a sample of how it kind of works. So the idea is that each kid and their technology group or station would all log in on a laptop, and then they have through a system like this, it's personalized to their deficits, and then they get instruction that is very specifically aligned to their needs. So it differentiates the learning, it gets them engaged with technology, and it's highly interactive, and it also allows you to progress monitor how they're doing on these very specific areas of deficit, and more than likely the goals are made up of some of these areas, so you can also use this to progress monitor your goals. So let's go to phase 3, and this is where we get into kind of the recursive review and probing questions. So at the very end of it, what we're going to be looking to do is when we come in the next day, or if it's a block, you could do it, later in the block, but more normally than not, what we're doing is the following day. And so you're going to reteach with a whole group paired and interactive teaching to areas of deficit and need, provide probing questions and higher level thinking questions in areas of strength. So you have to recall that you're going to have differentiation of learning abilities in your classroom. So you're going to have to really think through what your higher end kids learning wise are going to need. Then you're going to group students by deficit areas again and strength, and provide engaging higher level questions to students with strong performance and lower level questions to those who are struggling. So now you're getting into the probing question area, and you're trying to move up the levels of difficulty for the questions for each group, but you're doing the questions based on their very specific needs. So let's take a minute to talk about a quality of instruction and interactive instruction. I talked a little bit about it a moment ago, but this is really an ongoing issue, and it's been here for the 20 plus years I've been doing this, is this idea of, is this regular ed teacher the only one who should teach the content? The special ed teacher only teach the special ed kids? What does this look like? And I'll just tell you, if you don't get the regular ed teacher and special ed teacher working collaboratively, it's all for naught. So you have to look at the relationships of these folks and make sure they're people that will get along or do get along. Then you need to really, as a leader, emphasize the importance that you expect a quality of instruction. So you expect to see the special ed teacher doing some teaching, you expect the regular ed teacher to be doing some remediation and support, and you should see this kind of intricate dance between the regular ed and the special ed, and it should be difficult at times to tell who's the regular, who's the special ed. Now, this does mean the regular ed teacher and special ed teacher need to get on the same page. The special ed teacher needs to learn the content. And this really can take a lot of different forms, but if you don't have a quality of instruction, Then you have licensed teachers that become paraprofessionals, and they're doing lower level supports when what the IEP requires is higher level individualized instruction for the kiddos. So that's just something that's important to talk about and to set some expectations. And let me give you a few tips to remember. Again, plan together. Make sure that admins are giving the teachers opportunities to plan regularly and work collaboratively. Move. Never should you go into a classroom and just see the special ed teacher or regular ed teacher sitting at the back of the room. You should always be up and moving and engaging. Treat each other as equals. Again, we don't want to go into that teacher and teacher aide modality. Diagnostically screen all students. In a special ed or in an inclusion classroom with special ed students, you really need to know at a minimum why they're struggling so we can address those. Formatively track all progress. You need to be able to track the progress, particularly of your special education kids, so make sure you have a solid system in place. Separate into learning groups. Grouping is powerful. It's some of the best teaching I've ever seen. Stations and grouping are everything in inclusion, and with 2 teachers, it is easily done. Provide learning stations. Again, going into that grouping and that stations teaching, I recommend, depending on class size, but let's say you have a class of 25, I would go with stations of 5. Know all students' IEP goals, accommodations, and modifications. Again, the regular ed teacher should have a broad knowledge of it. The special education teacher should have a deep knowledge of it and a means for tracking this information. Protect instructional time, no errands or paperwork. And it's okay here and there, but this should not become the common role of particularly the special education teacher to run errands during instructional time. Because remember, guys, by law, these kids are given a certain number of minutes of inclusion time. So if you're out running errands, you're actually in non-compliance of federal law. Maximizing the dual teaching method. Again, having 2 people can be incredibly powerful if it's fully taken advantage of. And it really has to do with that equality of instruction. Okay, now, if anybody has any questions, I would be super happy to answer anything that anybody may have. Are you still with us, Ms. Lily, or did I put you to sleep?
Yes, no, absolutely not. This is actually a really great session. Thank you, Dr. Hulett.
Sure.
There are multiple questions. I'll start with the first one. In my school, there is often friction or levels of opposition between teachers in co-teaching roles. Do you have any tips on how to make the co-teaching process seamless for everyone?
Yeah, and I think administratively, and that's just my most recent lens as having been a principal for 12 years, is that we don't always do teachers a really good service in this area, and that friction is there because, one, the principal hasn't laid the expectation. All the core content teacher knows is they have all of the pressure and expectation for academic achievement, state standards, and then the special ed teacher normally comes in more of a passive role and knows they have all the paperwork compliance. And so, one, principals need to make it clear of what they expect out of the teachers, and if they expect an equal approach, then they need to reinforce that. And then the other piece that we do a poor job of is we don't give the teachers time to really interact, build relationships, and plan. Again, the best case scenario is where you have what I engaged in was, if it's English, you have one English teacher and a collaborative teacher that's with them all day long, and they do inclusion throughout the day. And that's your primary inclusion person, and you build the relationships, you get to know one another, and then you have a common planning. So I think some of this difficulty among teachers has to do with a lack of leadership quite often, and something we need to do a much better job of at the administrative levels.
Great. So here's one more question. There's a few more, and you can, depending on how time goes. This next question says, how would you suggest co-teachers collaborate effectively?
And I think some of that goes back to, what we were talking about. One is that planning piece. And the biggest piece moving forward is the special educator really needs to learn the content and needs to be prepared to present information in front of the whole class. Because what also happens is that friction, you know, you're both paid licensed teachers, you're both making similar money based on years of experience. So if you're teaching all day as a regular ed teacher and your inclusion teacher's in the back of that room not doing any teaching, resentment is going to grow. So one of the key ways, I think, to doing this is to ensuring that each of you has a role and each of you is providing equal contributions to that classroom. That's another really big area.
I apologize. I turned my camera on by accident. It shouldn't be on. Okay. One question here is based on your experience as a practitioner in education, how many times a week do you think educators should be co-planning?
Well, some folks say once a week minimum. My experience was you want a best case scenario, 5 days a week, they have common planning. Now, they might plan 3 days a week, you know, formally sitting down, going through it. But again, what I found is having 5 days a week with my partner, we didn't always formally plan, but we were in the same room, we're grading papers, we're talking, we're reflecting on kids. So I'm a big fan of five days a week, you have common planning, and that can make all the difference. And I saw it just be done expertly by some of my peers and colleagues who had that same opportunity. So definitely 5 days a week if possible. 1 day at a minimum.
Great. Here's one more question. What are some ways to help build an inclusion model with a paraprofessional, the para specifically?
Yeah, well, and I think that's where the guidance and expectation comes in, and it also varies so much on the ability of that paraprofessional. Now, you're not going to want them presenting content, but what you can really utilize a para well in is with station work, and you can have them also moving a great deal throughout the classroom. I've had some amazing paras that would have been amazing teachers, they just didn't have the formal education. So first of all, you have to assess the ability of the person, and then you really need to provide the guidance and expectations, and you need to serve in a way as their supervisor in that classroom and just give very direct expectations to them.
That's excellent. Actually, that answers the next question, which was, do you have any tips for working with paraprofessionals? So you kind of took care of that one. So moving on, as a special education full inclusion teacher, how do you communicate with other teachers the importance of serving as a full inclusion teacher rather than a paraprofessional?
Yeah, great question. And I think, you know, it comes down to what you can control is you can control being of value. And I'll tell you, when I did it, you know, I let the teacher know I wanted to teach. And hey, if there were any nuances that they wanted me to know of the content, please let me know. But I asked for opportunities to teach because I was coming into their classroom. The person was fine to do it. He was happy to have me teach. And so we kind of started with small chunks, and then I ended up teaching probably more than he did, to be quite honest with you. But the other piece is strong leadership. You have to have a principal saying, I expect to see a quality of instruction. I expect to see special educators teaching at least some component of instruction while we're in there. I expect to see you taking lead with small groups. If the principal doesn't do that, it becomes very hard to know exactly what is needed and wanted and what the expectation is. And more times than not, principals don't provide this leadership. And it's something that we're actually talking a lot about nationally that we need to really shift on. And but it's also training principals because they're not aware of this. So we have a lot to do, a lot of work to do in this area.
Thank you. And the next question asks, how can you encourage administrators to communicate progress monitoring data with parents?
Well, I think at the end of the day, that's a really good question. So all parents have a legal right to all data. So what I would say, if I'm the teacher, I would be sharing that directly to my parents. Now, if the principal is telling you not to share it, you know, depending on the relationship you have with the principal, you might want to let them know that actually they have a legal right to this data, although you might want to be careful in how you do that. But you could make an argument to them that you just think it's really important and you'll take the lead on sending it out. And because you have to send out progress reports on the goals as much as you send out report cards. So if you send out report cards every 9 weeks, then you need to send us progress reports, and that's where that formative data would be really appropriate to go home. So I'd have a conversation with the principal. Most principals, if it's not going to hurt anything, hey, have at it. So I would take those steps.
Excellent. And then there might be 1 or 2 more questions. Here's one. Can you share why we should be using data to inform IEPs?
Well, I hate to say it, but the main reason is for legal compliance. It protects the school. And at the end of the day, there was a big court case about 2 years ago that really reinforced that if schools don't have the data and can't prove that they have ambitious goals and they can't prove the kid's making progress, then if that parent chooses to put them in private school, the school can then be held accountable to pay for that private tuition, which is extremely expensive. So part of it's legal compliance. The other piece is just best instruction. We know when we have data, we have those aha moments and, oh, wow, I wouldn't have guessed that. And you think a kid's getting it, but they're really not. So data is kind of that objective third person in the room that just tells you what it is. I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but I will tell you there's a lot of options out there for doing formative assessment today.
Excellent, Dr. Hulett. I think that brings us to the end of our questions. I guess if anybody else has a question, please feel free to type it in the question box now.
And the other thing I would mention, Lily, is that if they have further questions and or they'd like my input on anything, just to go ahead and email. I think her info's up here, Christine Bucko, just to contact her directly, and she can get any and all questions to me. And I'd love to engage more in the conversation, but just reach out to Christine, and we'll go from there.
Yes, there is a company-wide effort here. So yeah, we do work as a team. So if there are any other questions, you can definitely send them directly to Christine. I'll give you a few more seconds or a few more minutes to type any more questions. And in case you need to log off, I just want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. Again, feel free to email us at cbucko@letsgolearn.com, and we'll be happy to answer any further questions you might have. We'll also be sending out some follow-up resource tools.
Your wait time is very impressive, Lily. I know you're a good teacher.
Well, we want to thank Dr. Kurt Hulett. Again, he's the National Director of Special Ed Services, and he took some of his time today to join us on our webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, feel free to email us if you have any further questions. We're going to go ahead and close the poll since it doesn't seem like anybody else has any further questions. Have a wonderful day, and thank you again for joining us.